Welcome everyone to the Psych Talk today. So today's topic is on anxiety. As always, I'll start with the disclaimer, I guess. This talk is intended to provide information and be educational. It is not meant for diagnosis, it's not meant for treatment. Just because you're experiencing some of the symptoms I'm going to talk about doesn't mean that you have an anxiety disorder. If you're experiencing anxiety symptoms and are concerned or want more information, please visit a health professional in your local area. That can be a doctor, a psychologist, psychiatrist, counselor, whatever it might be. So, and the reason I wanted to talk about anxiety is that sometimes people experiencing the symptoms, and there are a lot of them, that a lot of symptoms that can be associated with anxiety. Sometimes people experiencing them can wonder if there's something wrong with them. Anxiety is a pretty normal, natural experience, part of the human experience. It's part of the range of feelings we have every day. However, anxiety does trigger a range of changes in your body that happen often naturally and, more importantly, automatically, that people might not realize. And for some people, those changes, they might start attributing them to something being wrong with them. So often with educating around anxiety, we try and normalize it to say that even if you are experiencing some of these symptoms, it is quite normal, because that's what the body normally does. But also, of course, if you are quite distressed by the types of symptoms you're experiencing, or they're causing you to have a negative impact on your life, the symptoms, then please seek professional help. So the thing about anxiety is, and the reason that talking about it and providing information about it can be helpful, is that different symptoms of anxiety can actually trigger each other. And this is where people can spiral between sort of physical sensations of anxiety, so let's say rapid heartbeat, heavy breathing, and then if you start attributing thoughts to those, unhelpful thoughts like, oh, I'm panicking, there's definitely going to be, there's some sort of danger around me, something bad's going to happen, that can then the unhelpful thoughts can then trigger more physical sensations of anxiety, and that's where those spirals can actually culminate, in some people, into panic attacks, for instance. And for some people, a panic attack might not be a big deal, but for others it might be quite severe in its intensity, and it might last quite long. So, hopefully providing some understanding around anxiety can help people to realize that, oh, this is what I'm experiencing is a natural response of my body. I don't have to go towards those unhelpful thoughts, which will trigger worse outcomes. So, what is anxiety? A lot of people understand what fear is, right? And so the question is, well, what's the difference between fear and anxiety, right? Now, of course, both fear and anxiety, they're related, and both of them are part of the experience of being human. Fear is more of a response to danger that is realistic and that is present generally now or in the very near future. Okay. And fear is evolutionarily, and I'm going to talk a little bit about evolution because anxiety and fear arise a lot from our evolution. Evolutionarily, fear is quite a useful response because it's a survival instinct. Okay, so you can imagine that back when we were cave people, or hunter-gatherers, appropriate fear and avoidance, which I'll talk about a bit later, but appropriate fear and avoidance would have helped us in our chances of survival. Right, so fear of heights comes from a very adaptive fear of tall places being places where we might die if we fall off those tall places. Right? So fear is it's a survival instinct in terms of it was very useful, and even now fear can be useful as well. Right? We sense danger in certain areas. We sense danger when cars are coming across the road, and so we don't cross when a car is coming because we're fearful of that. We know what might happen if we do. So from an evolutionary point of view, that's ingrained in us, basically, to have appropriate fear and appropriate avoidance. And as a lot of people know, fear initiates a range of automated physiological responses, colloquially called fight or flight. Right, the fight or flight response. You'll hear that a lot in colloquial language. These days, there's been a third sort of category, and potentially a fourth, but a third one is freeze. So it's actually fight, flight, or freeze now, because it's been researched that some people actually, in the face of danger, they will freeze rather than fight or fly. But in general, fight or flight are the two responses that our body gears us up for when we experience fear. Okay, so what can happen is basically our body prepares us to either run for our lives, right? So if we were hunter-gatherers, we see a fierce animal, like a tiger, for instance, our body will gear us to either run for our lives, or let's say we are taking part in a battle between tribes. There is still some fear, of course, because you are in mortal danger. You're fighting for your life. But in that case, your body might be preparing you for actual conflict, for aggression, for fight. So fear, again, is a response to danger that is realistic and generally present now or in the very near future. What is anxiety in that context? So anxiety has a very similar function to fear, and it triggers very similar responses in us. The main difference is that anxiety can occur, and most often occurs, in the absence of real or present danger. So remember, fear is a response to danger that is realistic and generally quite present. Anxiety occurs in the absence of that. Generally, it's anticipatory, it's around what ifs, around future occurrences, and this is where anxiety can sometimes become problematic, because we can think there is danger based on experiences or beliefs when actually there is none. Right? So we might be triggering all of these responses in our body that gear us up for fight or flight when actually the danger is not present or not going to be present at the time when we anticipate it to be. As an example, if you're walking down a dark alley, right, alone, at night, a lot of us are going to feel anxious. Right? It's quite natural to feel anxious walking down that dark alley alone. There's no one around you. And the anxiety is often, if you really think about it, the anxiety is around what ifs, right? Because you're walking down a dark alley. Darkness doesn't, it's not a threat to us in terms of being a real and present danger to ourselves, right? Darkness doesn't kill you. Darkness doesn't harm you inherently. Walking down that alley doesn't harm you. It being a narrow alley doesn't harm you. So there's no real and present danger, except we may have beliefs around what darkness represents. Darkness represents danger. Being alone represents danger. Because if there were people attacking me, I don't have anyone to help. There are other what ifs as well. Perhaps more irrational ones like ghosts, or monsters appearing, or whatever it might be. Our brains can sometimes run away with those thoughts. So walking down the alley doesn't necessarily present a real and present danger, and yet we feel anxiety, and the anxiety triggers fear. So anxiety arises simply from a belief, and that's where the problem for some people can lie, because beliefs are a lot harder to challenge than real or present danger. Because you can say, well, if a tiger is there, then I should be fearful. But I can very easily tell somebody, why are you fearful? There's no tiger there, right? The tiger has left. That's very easy to challenge because you can sense that. Challenging the belief, if let's say you're on a phone call to somebody in that alley, trying to say, oh, you'll be fine, they're unlikely to just take your word for it, because their beliefs are quite ingrained that what walking down that alley in the dark represents is danger. And the thing with anxiety in modern life, so the thing is, evolutionarily, anxiety was so useful for us because it kept us alive. And based on the theories of evolution, whatever kept us alive was more likely to be transmitted through genetics. So people who were more prone to be anxious would have, you can imagine, prepared more for, say, winter coming. They would have been more anxious about storing more food, maybe, and that might have, got them past tough winters where more blasé people might have died from starvation. More anxious people would maybe be less likely to participate in war, less likely to participate in conflict, less likely to go near cliff edges to do dangerous things. So more anxious people were probably more likely to survive and more likely to pass their genes along. So unfortunately, it's possible, if you subscribe to evolutionary psychology, that we are the product of many, many generations, many millions of years of evolution of anxious people. The problem is that the definitions of what would have been considered threats in the past now are very broad. So the definition of what a threat is now very broad, and the threats are often very meta level. So, as an example, I've written some examples here. I'm just going to go through them, and I'm sure you guys will sort of know what they mean without necessarily me providing an example to all of them. But threat to reputation, right? And remember, the threats in the past were very real and present, mostly, right? Threat of falling off a cliff, threat of someone attacking you, someone robbing you, threat of a tiger, right? Threat to reputation, threat to financial security, threat to your place in the social hierarchy, threat to your identity, threat to your ego, threat to your self-confidence, threat to your relationships, right? All of these are things that we get anxious about these days that are not real and present and easy to deal with. As an example of, so let's say doing well in an exam, right? Whether or not you do well in an exam is a threat to so many different meta level aspects of your life, right? It's a threat to your reputation. What will I tell my friends? What will I tell my family if I fail? How will I be employed? How will I be judged by people because of my employment, because of how I do in this exam? It might be a threat to your self-confidence, right? You might start doubting yourself more. You might have thought yourself quite a good student before. Now you're starting to, starting to maybe doubt some of that. Maybe it's a threat to your ego as well. We all like to have that confidence in ourselves. And so for the next exam, you might make a lot of changes based on the anxieties that occurred or that arose out of that one event. Another one these days, social media. I'm not a fan of social media. I don't use it very much. Because social media, there are good parts to it. But one of the huge problems with social media is its really insidious ability to trigger unhelpful emotions, thoughts in people, and one of them is anxiety. Anxiety is a huge part of, unfortunately, many people's experiences of social media. So, seeing other people doing better than you, seeing other people traveling, seeing other people buying new things, seeing other people have children, getting married, having relationships, or even a very basic thing like seeing other people get more likes than you on a post can be, for some people, anxiety provoking. And these are very, as I said, very meta level threats because they're not an immediate threat to your person. They don't immediately put you in danger. They don't immediately harm you. But they do, they are a threat, and we perceive a harm. We believe they harm us in a meta level way. So, that maybe me making a post and then getting critical comments on it might be a threat to my reputation, my place in the social hierarchy, that sort of thing. Whether or not you get a promotion becomes a huge perceived threat, for instance, maybe to your financial security, which is important to a lot of people. It could be a threat to your relationship. You might perceive that your partner will be more likely to leave you. Your relationship will be rockier if there's less finances to go around at the home. So those are all examples, and I'm sure you can come up with a lot more around how anxiety has changed and how it now affects us in such a broad and meta level way than it used to. So having said all of that, I'll probably go into a little bit about what anxiety looks like and what are the symptoms to sort of look out for, because as I've sort of just explained, and also I explained in a previous video around the relationship between anxiety and performance and how being overly anxious can be unhelpful for performance. Often it can be useful to identify when we are experiencing the symptoms of anxiety, because we know that often those symptoms are not helpful actually for our experience. So if we are walking down that dark alleyway, some of these anxiety symptoms and the spirals of anxiety that can occur within us aren't actually that helpful for our experience of walking down that alley. When we do have a critical exam or a promotion coming up that we might be anxious about, to understand what kinds of symptoms might be going through us, and understand that those are natural responses, they're automatic responses, and they're not really, that we shouldn't really be taking too many cues on how to act and how to respond based on those automatic responses that are cued into us. So there's sort of, as I mentioned, anxiety generally serves two functions, either fighting or fleeing. And nowadays we sort of include freezing in that, but I won't really talk about that too much here. So it's a natural automated response of our bodies to danger, whether real or perceived. And the purpose of anxiety and fear is actually to protect us. So it's not inherently harmful. None of the symptoms I'm going to go through are really inherently harmful to us, unless we sort of stay with them for longer than the body really intends us to. Because the body is trying to gear us up for a reaction to a threat. Okay, so I'll split this up into sort of three categories. There's physical, the physical system, the reactions from the physical system, the reactions from a cognitive perspective, so thoughts, and the reaction from a behavioral system. But the main one I want to go through is the physical reactions that many of us will have to anxiety. So, belief that we are in danger activates a range of temporary changes. It's important to note that all of these reactions are temporary, even though experiences of anxiety can feel like they are prolonged and they go on forever for some people. The reactions were only intended to be temporary. If they do get prolonged, it's either because the anxiety is coming and going in waves, or we're re-triggering the fear by thinking about or perceiving fear in our minds. Again, all of these reactions are supposed to help in either running away, fighting, or both. Right? So what generally happens is, as soon as danger is perceived, your brain will send messages to your, what we call the autonomic nervous system. And this will activate two parts of your nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic later on. The names, you don't really need to remember them, but basically there is, it turns on, there is an on switch basically and an off switch that your body has. It's two different systems to ramp up and then sort of calm down. Okay, so when you do perceive danger, whether again it's real or perceived, your body will kickstart the system that is readying you for action, and it releases some hormones and neurochemicals. The important ones are adrenaline, noradrenaline, from the adrenal glands and kidneys, and basically these help to regulate the physical changes. So they will key up your physical changes and then maintain them for a certain amount of time before your calming system kicks in. So what are some of these changes? Okay, so a big one is the increase in the strength and rate of your heartbeat. Many of us, when we get anxious, will experience either an increase in the strength of heartbeat, the rate of your heartbeat, or both. And what this is supposed to do is it enables blood to be pumped around the body faster. It enables oxygen to be delivered to your tissues and organs that are vital for fight or flight, and it enables more efficient elimination of waste, right? But for some people, we can perceive that increase as very uncomfortable, and we can start thinking, for some people, around, well, is there something wrong with me? What's going on? It can feel quite panicky just having your heart rate increase. Second, or another thing that happens with the sympathetic nervous system kicking in is a redistribution of blood. So your body, what it does is it actually takes blood away from less vital areas and it gives it to more important ones, or at least more important ones for fight or flight. Okay, so it will take blood away from, for instance, your skin, your fingers, your toes, your extremities. And this can lead to people feeling, when they're anxious, sensations of cold or numb fingers, or tingling in their fingers and toes. You'll very commonly hear this said about people who have been scared, that they look very pale, right? And that's part of it. That's part of the blood rushing away from your face into your large muscle groups. So generally your legs and your arms, ready to either fight or run away. And into certain organs, into your heart as well, because you're trying to pump oxygen around to these vital areas of your body. Often the blood will be redistributed away from your stomach and your bladder as well, because they're not really integral in fighting or running away. And that's where sensations like butterflies in your stomach might occur. Sensations like needing to go to the toilet, needing to pee when you're anxious, can occur because the blood is no longer in those muscles as much as in other areas. One of the other big changes is an increase in the rate and depth of breathing. And again, this is to provide tissues and organs with extra oxygen. So not only is your blood trying to pump all the oxygen to your extremity, to your large muscle groups, but also your body is trying to take in more oxygen to give to your large muscle groups, to prepare for action. And you can imagine that increases in the rate and depth of your breathing can induce in people feelings of, for instance, breathlessness, feelings of choking or smothering, even though your oxygen is actually more than usual, not less, tightness or pain in the chest, and even yawning or fatigue, because of where that oxygen is going. It's going into your muscle groups. It's not necessarily going into your brain, for instance. And that's one of the interesting things. Even though your brain will have changes, often the blood supply increase and the oxygen increase doesn't actually go to your brain, because your brain doesn't need to do extra deep calculations in these circumstances. Your brain is basically in fight or flight mode, right? It has very simple decisions to make. So the body is saying, we don't necessarily need blood in the brain as much as we do in fighting or fleeing. So that can also lead to people feeling dizzy, lightheaded. Some people might have blurred vision or hot flushes when they're anxious. And some of the other things that will happen when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, an increase in sweating will happen for a lot of people, and that's to prevent overheating of your body. But again, even though it might be intended to do that, we might interpret these things as getting very hot under the collar when we're anxious, and wondering what's going on. There will often be a widening of the pupil and eyes, so you'll see people who are quite fearful, again, the sort of stereotype, the pale face, and the widening of the pupils, right? Dilated pupils. That's generally to let more light in, so that we can see better, whether in the daytime or at night. That's the original function. But again, when we see somebody else in that frightened state, we might interpret that to say, oh, well, danger's around, rather than they've perceived some danger in their mind that may or may not be here at all. As I said before, there's a decreased activity of the digestive system, because again, that's not necessary for fight or flight. So some people might experience dry mouth, nausea, and as I said before, butterflies in the stomach when you're anxious. Even, if you're going on a date for the first time, people will feel anxious about that, because again, the meta level threat of, will this go well? What if I get rejected? Right? That has consequences for your self-identity, for your ego. So feeling butterflies in your stomach when you're going on a date, again, is part of this response, part of this anxiety response. And one of the big ones is muscle tension, because we've talked about all of the places where we're taking things away. Well, where is it all going? It's going to our muscles. And that's where many people will feel really keyed up. Their muscles will be really tense when they're anxious. And this is where, some people go for massages. And, some people say, oh, a nice shoulder massage when I'm, all keyed up and tense from work, whatever it might be, is really helpful to sort of relax those muscles, despite what your body is trying to do to gear yourself up. Muscle tension can result in aches and pains. It can result in trembling or shaking. Sometimes when we get really anxious, that can happen. And fatigue and exhaustion, if that happens over a longer period. You can imagine that our muscles will start getting tired. So when the perceived danger is over, as I said before, we have another system that kicks in called the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's designed to restore the body to the relaxed state, because we know that, all of those changes that I just mentioned, all those physical changes, are not sustainable. Right? We can't keep our body running at that state for too long. That will start being harmful to us, right? So we have a system that does that automatically. So it slows our heart rate, it slows our breathing, it relaxes our muscles. The thing is, that system is very gradual, and that's for a good reason, because in the past, when we had a danger like, let's say, a fierce animal, or in wartime, whatever it might be, you don't want to just, as soon as that tiger is no longer in view, immediately relax everything. Because we know from experience that just because we can't see the danger, or the danger has just passed, doesn't mean, we can just relax. We still need to be prepared a little bit. And what that means is the process of restoration back to your original state is very slow, and it's much slower than the process of activation, right? So kicking up in terms of your anxiety is much quicker, unfortunately, than coming down or calming down. And that's natural for everybody, unfortunately. So this is where people can feel, even though the anxiety is past, even though there's nothing that you can really sense that should be giving you anxiety, people can still feel like some of these residual effects are in place. They can still feel muscle tension. They can still feel that their heart rate's a little bit faster than normal. They can still feel they're breathing a bit more than normal. Okay, so those are the main physical symptoms. What about the changes in thoughts in your cognitive system? Well, one of the major changes is that attention is shifted. And the way it generally shifts is that it's towards your surroundings. So actually, normally, there's a lot of very good research on attention. There's a lot of detail on that, but I don't really have the scope to go through that. But in general, our attention is normally quite focused. So in general, human beings are very good at filtering out maybe 80% of what's going on around us, all of the sounds. You know, if let's say you're at a cafe, you need to hear the person and attend to the person across the table talking to you. We're very good at being able to filter out all the other sounds around us, all the other stimuli, you know, other people waving their hands for the waiter or whatever it might be. We're very good at that. But in this change, what our bodies are saying is that, okay, we now need to shift our attention from the narrow to the broad. We need to start scanning. We need to be looking everywhere for potential threats. So some people, and this is actually quite commonly reported with anxiety, is that people actually say they find it much more difficult to concentrate. They find it much more difficult to narrow their focus when they're anxious, because the brain has actually switched its attention from focused to broad. Again, that's a very simplistic explanation, but that's, for some people, that's why they find it very difficult to concentrate when they're anxious. And also, another change is our brain sort of prioritizes quick and shallow, right? Because instead of pondering, you know, the philosophy of life or whatever, right? Or in-depth analysis of mathematics, whatever it might be, we now need to make very quick and simple decisions. Fight, flee. Fight who? Right? How far away is the predator? What kind of speed are they moving at? When are they going to get to me? Do I have the weapon to fight them? Can I find a weapon in my environment to fight them? If I can't, do I have backup? Are we enough to fight this? Okay, if not, run. So the prioritization becomes for speed of thoughts, and that's why some people can find that their thoughts start racing. Some people describe racing thoughts, you know, all these different thoughts going through their head very quickly. And some people can also describe sort of looking for trouble, which means which can be unhelpful, because some of these anxieties that we're talking about aren't actually real, right? But what this sort of shift in focus makes us do is look for cues in our environment that confirm our suspicions. So often anxiety can re-trigger itself and sustain itself because our focus is now on looking for trouble, basically, right? If we're anxious about, let's say, the dark alley, right? We're walking down that dark alley. We're anxious. We're now looking at every single shadow, every single bit of movement, every flicker of a light, to look for trouble. And that's why we get so caught off guard when there's a quote-unquote jump scare of, let's say, a cat walking across or whatever it might be, because we're so in tune with our environment that we're actually looking for signs that confirm that we are in danger. And more broadly, your mind will generally try to prioritize pessimistic thoughts, because you're trying to prepare for the worst. Basically, when you're keyed up, when you're quite anxious, you want to be preparing for the worst. That's what your brain's telling you is helpful, which means you might be more likely to give weight to pessimistic thoughts than optimistic ones. And just finally, changes in the behavioral system. I mean, this one's not so in depth. Basically, the two main behaviors that you can choose from are fight or run. Fight or flight, right? Now, that's in the past. Transposed to current day, what these might look like is aggressive behavior in terms of fight, right? Choosing to be aggressive towards someone in a conversation, right? So not necessarily, with fists, but being more aggressive, being more abrasive, being more confrontational if you're choosing to fight through an anxiety. Or for a lot of people, what it looks like is avoidance. So that's the big one that a lot of people choose, which is, nope, I'm out of here. Right? Nope, 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 nope. That can also branch off into things like procrastination, right? Sometimes procrastination is due to anxiety around having to perform at a task. The procrastination is the avoidance and using other coping strategies to deal with that anxiety. So one of the problems with this behavioral system is that sometimes it's not possible, perhaps due to social constraints, for instance, sometimes it's not possible to be aggressive or leave a situation. Sometimes you have to sit in a situation with your discomfort, with your anxiety, even though you really want to leave, right? You know, you might be on a date, you might be at a party, you might be whatever. Yes, you could just, if you're really anxious and, you know, you're not feeling it, you could just get up and walk out of the date. But socially, most of us know that that's not really an appropriate thing to do. We sit there, we try and, you know, end the night at least in a more appropriate way. Maybe some people in a classroom get really anxious about something. They're being told about something, they don't understand what the teacher's saying. They're starting to get anxious about not understanding, or the teacher's talking about an upcoming assessment and they're very anxious. Again, it's very difficult to just get up and leave the classroom. So, you know, unfortunately, even though these are the responses that are automatically keyed into us, the fight or flight, often just societal constraints make it very difficult for us to pursue them. And that's where people can use all sorts of different ways. As I said before, procrastination is one of them, but all sorts of different ways to try and express or handle this pent-up need to fight or flee. So things like foot tapping, pacing, irritability, snapping at people, passive-aggressive language, all of these can be ways in which people try to express their fight or flight in less sort of direct ways. So that's pretty much where I'll end it for today. What I might do in the next couple of talks, and I'll sort of gauge interest from Discord and that sort of thing, is I might go into the two most common disorders associated with anxiety. So this is talking about very common experiences of anxiety and normalizing it, and it is very normal. A lot of people will experience a lot of these differences, but a lot of these symptoms. But there are some anxiety disorders where I would say to people, if you are experiencing these symptom groups, these syndromes, to please seek help. And the most common two are generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder. So I'll sort of gauge interest in whether people want me to talk about those specifically, and those might be the next talks we go to. And again, just to sort of repeat the disclaimer, the talk is intended for informational and educational purposes. It is not meant for diagnosis. It is not meant for treatment. Just because you're experiencing some of these symptoms that I've talked about doesn't mean you have an anxiety disorder at all. And if you are experiencing anxiety symptoms and are concerned, or you want more information, please visit a health professional in your local area. Okay. Finally, as with my other talks, there are some quotes that I quite like that are a little bit related to the topic, but this is just basically me being able to give a few quotes that I like. I've got sort of 3-ish today. The first one is, I've got 99 problems, and 86 of them are completely made up scenarios in my head that I'm stressing about for absolutely no logical reason. A little bit of a cheeky one. But, you know, as I said before, most of the anxiety today is triggered by perceived threats, meta-level threats, and what-if scenarios. Most of them are what-if scenarios that make us anxious these days. And if we really think about them, maybe some of them aren't as rational as we make them out to be. The second one is it's not really a quote. I mean, I don't have sources for all of these, but if you do, please tell me. The second one is a bit of a list. So 1, going to bed early. 2, not leaving my house. 3, not going to a party. Summary: my childhood punishments have now become my adult goals. I'll let that. You can analyze that reality for yourself. And the third one, again, I don't really have a source for this, unfortunately. Fear is interest paid on a debt you may not owe. And just finally, a big credit to the Center for Clinical Interventions, where I get a decent chunk of my information. The CCI is a specialist clinical psychology service supported by the Western Australian Government. Their website is cci.health.wa.gov.au. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'll catch you in the next Psych Talk.